In this lecture video, I'm going to talk about three powers that are unique to the House of Representatives. Now, some of them we've discussed already when we talked about the Constitution, but since we talked about it a long time ago, I'm going to go over some of them again just to be clear. Also, one of the things you should notice is that not only is this in the lecture notes, but if you look at the learning objectives, this is also in the learning objectives. I'm not going to say that you should ignore anything that's not in the learning objectives because sometimes I'll talk about something and it builds off of something that explains something that's in the learning objectives. But if you notice in the learning objectives that one of the questions is you'll be able to identify three powers unique to the House of Representatives, and here it is, powers unique to the House of Representatives. That means that it's got a pretty good chance of being on the exam. Now, let me rephrase that. Not that it has a good chance of being on the exam, because Canvas randomly selects the essays, but it has a good chance of being among the questions that are going to be on the exam. So just be mindful of that and be strategic. So the first power unique to the House of Representatives. Any bill that involves raising revenue has to pass the House of Representatives first. So what do I mean by that? First, what do I mean by raising revenue? When you're raising revenue, revenue is money. So any bill that brings more money into the federal government is an example of raising revenue. That can be increasing taxes. It can also be reducing taxes. It can be increasing fees on certain services that the federal government provides, like taxing industries more or charging people more for their passports, anything like that. Any bill that involves raising revenue has to pass the House of Representatives first. The framers felt like the House of Representatives was the chamber that was closest to the people. They represented a fewer number of people. As I said before, originally, members of Congress represented around 30,000 people. A senator represents everybody in the state. And they change out every 2 years. And so if people are pissed off about a bill that was passed that is raising more revenue, then members of Congress, members of the House are going to have to be worried about that and be reluctant to do so. And so the framers wanted it to pass the House first and then go to the Senate. Every once in a while, the Senate will pass a bill that raises revenue in some way. When they send it to the House will send something called a blue slip. They'll send a little blue slip, send it back to the Senate and basically say, read your Constitution, man. Bills that raise revenue have to start in the House. Second power, unique to the House of Representatives. And we've talked about this when we talked about the Constitution. If no presidential candidate gets a majority of electoral votes, then the House selects the president. I believe they have to select from the top 3 vote getters, right? But the House selects the president. And as I explained before, although the House is based on proportional representation, in this one instance, each state, their delegation gets 1 vote. So Wyoming gets 1 vote, California gets 1 vote, North Dakota gets 1 vote, Texas gets 1 vote, right? And the Constitution doesn't specify how the states are supposed to determine who they're going to vote for. That's left up to the states to do. Presumably it would be majority rule, but that's up to the states to decide. Then the third power unique to the House of Representatives, the power of impeachment. Now remember, from when we talked about this before, when we talked about the Constitution, is impeachment the same as removal? No. Man, if you got that wrong, part of me is like crying. When a president is impeached, All that means is that the House has determined that there's a sufficient amount of evidence to hold a trial. It's kind of like, in legal terms, it's like being indicted. It's like being charged with a crime, right? The trial takes place in the Senate. And so as far as the House is concerned, they'll hold hearings, and then they'll vote on what are called articles of impeachment. And if a majority vote in favor of an article of impeachment or multiple articles of impeachment, then the next step in the process is for there to be a trial, but that takes place in the Senate. Okay. Now the House has a role in the trial, but we'll discuss that when we talk about powers unique to the United States Senate. So let's talk about the Senate. In terms of membership in the Senate, there are 100 members in the United States Senate, 2 per each state. Presumably, if additional states were added, then there would be additional members of the Senate. But we have 50 states, so 2 times 50 is 100, so there are 100 members of the United States Senate. In terms of their method of election, originally, when the Constitution was originally ratified and adopted, members of the Senate were elected indirectly. Now, if you recall from the lecture on the Constitution, an indirect election is one where voters vote for somebody, and then whoever they vote for selects their representative. Or let me be more clear on that. Originally, the way it worked is that people in the states would vote for their state legislators, not the legislators in Washington, D.C., but the state legislators. For example, we have a state legislature in California, in Sacramento. The way the Constitution originally was designed, we voted for our state legislators, and then they selected our senators. So that's why we call it indirect election. We're not voting directly for the senator, right? The voters don't get to pick their senators. We get to pick somebody who then goes ahead and picks the senator. An indirect election. Then, in 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed, and it changed the way senators were elected, right? Now they're elected directly. So the House is elected directly, and the Senate is elected directly. In terms of their term of office, members of the Senate serve for 6 years. But like the House of Representatives, there are no term limits. They can run for as many times as people will re-elect them, right? So no term limits. In fact, the only office for which there are term limits is the presidency, which we've talked about, but that wasn't even originally in the Constitution because the framers didn't write term limits into the Constitution. The only reason that presidents served 2 terms is because originally because George Washington served 2 terms and then he stepped down. And basically every other president followed his lead until Franklin Roosevelt. And then once Franklin Roosevelt, because he served 4 terms, once Franklin Roosevelt passed away, then they amended the Constitution. That's the 22nd Amendment. They amended the Constitution so presidents were limited to 2 terms. Representation in the Senate is non-proportional, right? It's not based on population. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of their population. That's why Wyoming has 2 senators and California has 2 senators, because it doesn't matter. Population is irrelevant. And 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So, in 2022, there were 34 members of the Senate who were up for re-election. In 2024, because I'm recording this in 2022, there'll be 33 members of the Senate up for re-election. In 2026, there'll be 33 senators up for re-election. Then in 2028, everybody who was elected in 2022, they'll be up for re-election. Everybody who was elected in 2024, they'll be up for re-election in 2030, and everyone elected in 2026 will be up for re-election in 2032. Now, I know this is going to make this video go a little bit longer than I wanted to, but let's just get the formal leadership of the Senate out of the way. The president of the Senate, that's the official position. The president of the Senate is actually the vice president of the United States. The vice president is a unique position because it's the only position in the federal government where there's one person, the vice president, who is a member of the executive branch, but also a member in a way of the legislative branch. The vice president is the president of the Senate. Now, usually this is a ceremonial position. They don't really do anything. They don't hang out in the Senate. They don't debate on the floor of the Senate. They don't do any of that, right? So most of the time it's a ceremonial position. But if the Senate is voting on a bill and it's a 50-50 tie, the vice president gets to break the tie. So if there are 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, and the vice president is a Democrat, then they get to cast the 51st vote, and the Democrats will be considered the majority party. If it's a 50-50 Senate, and the vice president is a Republican, then the Senate will be the majority, then the Republicans will be the majority party. Now, these are some of the powers that are associated with the majority leader. The majority leader is the leader of the Senate. The majority leader has the right of first recognition. Now, I put an asterisk next to that because I want you to hold on to that. I can't explain it right now because it has everything to do with the filibuster. And we'll talk about the filibuster. But the majority leader has the right of first recognition. Additionally, the majority leader controls the agenda. They're the one who controls what bills are going to be debated, discussed, voted on, and all that. But they're not as powerful as the Speaker of the House. They don't have that kind of power. And the more I explain how the Senate works, the more you'll understand why. Then there's the minority leader. The minority leader is the leader of the minority party. Now, they work very, very closely with the majority leader because power in the Senate is really weird and different than in the House. If you're the majority party in the House, you can basically do whatever you want. The Speaker of the House has tremendous amount of power. The majority leader has a lot of power, but they really need to work with the minority leader to get things done. So the minority leader works with the majority leader to sort of organize things. And the minority leader winds up being the chief spokesman for the minority party. Also, just like in the House, there are party whips for both parties. You know, these are the ones who sort of whip people into shape. But the thing to know is that it's much harder to whip senators. It's much harder to sort of try and put pressure on them. Senators are very, very powerful, and if you push them too hard, you'll piss them off, and you don't want to do that. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about powers that are unique to the United States Senate.